I finally opened the folder. The numbers were highlighted in yellow. Total assets. Estimated value. A breakdown of everything my grandparents left me in their will, not us, me. My father cleared his throat. You know your brother can't manage this kind of responsibility. My brother didn't say anything. He rarely does in tense conversations. He has a mild cognitive disability, nothing that keeps him from living independently, but enough that paperwork overwhelms him. Numbers stress him out. Contracts make him freeze. I've always handled things for him. Forms. Phone calls. Bills when he forgot, but this wasn't helping him fill out a lease agreement, this was liquidating my inheritance and transferring it into a trust under his name. It's not about fairness, my mom said gently. It's about need. That word hit harder than anything else. Need. I work a stable job. I rent a decent apartment. I don't struggle. My brother works part-time and still lives in the small house our parents own. On paper, it makes sense, and that's what scared me, because if it makes sense on paper, then refusing makes me the villain. I'll think about it, I said. My mom's lips tightened. There isn't much to think about. That's when I noticed something strange. The document was dated 3 weeks ago. They hadn't asked if I would do this, they'd already planned for me to, and my brother still hadn't said a word. People assume that being the healthy sibling means you get more freedom. In our house, it meant you got less attention. My brother's diagnosis came when he was 6. I was 9. I don't remember the exact words the doctors used, just the way my parents' posture changed after that year. Everything became softer around him. Slower. Careful, and everything around me became efficient. I learned how to microwave dinner before I could ride a bike without training wheels. I learned not to complain when my birthday dinner got postponed because he had a bad day. I learned that if I handled my own problems quietly, my parents could focus on the bigger ones. They never said it outright. But I absorbed it anyway. He needs more, so I became the strong one. The independent one, the one who doesn't ask. When my grandparents visited, though, something shifted. They'd sit me at the kitchen table and ask about school. About what I liked. About my plans. They noticed things. My grandfather once told me, "You carry more than people see." I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought he was just being sentimental, but as I got older, I realized something uncomfortable. My grandparents treated me like I mattered separately from my brother, not as the support character in his story. When they passed within a year of each other, I grieved them differently than I expected. It wasn't just losing grandparents, it felt like losing the only witnesses to my side of the family dynamic. At the will reading, I already knew something would be uneven, I just didn't know how uneven, and I definitely didn't know how much that imbalance would expose. At the will reading, my parents sat on either side of my brother like he might drift away if they didn't anchor him. The lawyer spoke in that slow, neutral tone they're trained to use. Assets. Property. Investments. Sentimental items. My grandparents had been more comfortable than I realized. Quietly strategic with money. Careful. When he said my name, my mother straightened. The house, the brokerage account, the majority share of everything liquid. My brother received a smaller cash amount and my grandfather's watch. Silence filled the room in a way that felt louder than shouting. I looked at my brother first. His expression didn't change much. He nodded slightly, as if this was information about someone else. My father cleared his throat. There must be some mistake. The lawyer shook his head. The will is very clear. Very clear. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exposed. Like someone had turned on a spotlight and said, "This one matters differently." Afterward, in the parking lot, my mother finally said it, "They must have assumed you'd share." Not asked, assumed. I remember staring at the asphalt between my shoes. I hadn't even processed the numbers yet, and already it wasn't mine. It was pre-allocated in their minds. For the next few months, nothing happened. No pressure. No arguments. Just this quiet expectation hanging in the air. My brother never brought it up, but every time I helped him with something small, renewing a subscription, fixing a bank login, I felt my parents watching me like they were measuring something, testing whether I'd live up to the role I'd been assigned my whole life, the strong one, the responsible one, the one who gives. The first real crack didn't come from money, it came from paperwork. About 2 months after the will reading, I stopped by my parents' house to help my brother review a benefits form. He gets some state assistance tied to income limits, and any financial change can complicate things. While he was in the kitchen grabbing water, I glanced at a folder on the dining table. It was labeled with my name. I shouldn't have opened it. But I did. Inside were printed copies of the inheritance documents. And something else, a handwritten note from my mother. If he refuses, we may need to explain why the distribution was structured this way. Refuses, explain why, structured this way. The phrasing felt deliberate. Calculated. I heard my brother's footsteps and closed the folder quickly, but something had shifted. This wasn't just about fairness or need. There was strategy involved. Planning. That night, I replayed the will reading in my head. My grandparents had always been direct people. If they wanted equal distribution, they would have written it that way. If they wanted my brother provided for differently, they could have set up a trust themselves, but they didn't. They gave it to me, not accidentally. Not vaguely. Clearly, and my parents' note suggested they had an explanation ready. If I resisted, an explanation for what? For why I deserved it, or for why they needed it to look like I did? For the first time, a thought crossed my mind that I immediately tried to push away. What if the inheritance wasn't about rewarding me? What if it was correcting something? And what if my parents were terrified of what I might discover if I kept digging? I asked the lawyer for a copy of the full estate file. I told myself it was practical. Tax planning. Asset management. Adult responsibility, the truth. I wanted to see if there were notes attached. Letters. Addendums. Anything that hinted at motive. He emailed everything within a day. Most of it was standard. Legal language. Signatures. Dates. Witnesses, but buried in the scanned attachments was something I didn't remember hearing about during the reading, a letter from my grandmother. Addressed to me. Separate from the will, it wasn't long. She wrote about how proud she was that I had grown into someone steady. She mentioned that I had carried more weight than anyone should at that age. And then there was one sentence that wouldn't leave me alone. This is meant to balance what was never balanced. Balance what? I read it 3 times, it sounded almost corrective, like a scale that had tipped too far one way. My first assumption was obvious. Maybe she thought my parents had focused too much on my brother growing up. Maybe this was her way of compensating me. That explanation felt clean. Logical. Almost comforting. I leaned into it. For a week, I convinced myself that was the truth. My grandparents had seen the dynamic. They wanted to even things out. Simple, and if that was the case, then my parents asking me to give it up wasn't just about helping my brother. It was undoing something intentional. That realization hardened something inside me, but there was still one detail that didn't sit right. If this was just about fairness between siblings. Why did my mother's note sound like a warning? Why would they need to explain the structure unless the structure revealed something they didn't want exposed? The false clarity started to crack. And this time, I couldn't ignore it. I decided to confront it head-on, not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just calmly. I invited my parents over to my apartment under the pretense of discussing logistics. I even made coffee like it was a normal Sunday visit. I read Grandma's letter, I said. My mother's eyes flickered. Just for a second, she mentioned balance, I continued. Were they trying to compensate for how things were growing up? There it was. The theory I'd been building. The clean explanation. My father leaned back in his chair. Your grandparents always thought we were too focused on your brother. So it was intentional, I said. My mom exhaled slowly. They felt you sacrificed a lot. Sacrificed. The word felt validating. Almost soothing. For a moment, everything lined up. My grandparents noticed the imbalance. They corrected it through the will. My parents, still in protective mode, wanted to redirect the resources to my brother. 2 philosophies colliding. It made sense. It almost felt resolved. And then my father added something that didn't match the rest of the narrative. They didn't understand the full picture. I frowned. What picture? He hesitated. My mother's hand tightened around her mug. Nothing, she said quickly. Just family complexities. Family complexities, that phrase lingered long after they left, if this was just about favoritism or imbalance. There wouldn't be a full picture my grandparents missed, and the more I replayed that conversation, the more I realized something unsettling. My parents weren't arguing that the will was unfair, they were arguing that it was incomplete because my grandparents didn't know something. The question wasn't whether the inheritance was meant to balance the past, the question was what exactly needed balancing. The doubt didn't hit all at once. It seeped in, a comment here, a memory there. I started replaying childhood moments I hadn't thought about in years. Small inconsistencies. Things that felt insignificant at the time, like how my grandparents would sometimes take me out alone when they visited. Just me. Ice cream. Hardware store trips. Long drives where my grandfather asked questions that felt strangely specific. Do you feel things are fair at home? I used to shrug. Fair wasn't a word we used. Functional was. Another memory surfaced. I was 13. My brother had broken something expensive, an old camera that belonged to my grandfather. My parents blamed it on confusion. My grandparents didn't argue, but I remember my grandmother watching my parents in a way that wasn't approving. At the time, I assumed she was frustrated about the damage. Now I wondered if it was something else. I did something I probably should have done earlier. I requested older financial records tied to the estate. Transfers. Gifts. Anything significant from the last 20 years, it took effort. A few phone calls. Some identity verification. When the documents finally arrived, I spread them across my kitchen table like evidence in a trial. There were regular transfers from my grandparents to my parents over the years. Large ones, far larger than I ever knew, labeled vaguely, family support. Medical. Education. Education for who? I paid for most of my own college through loans and scholarships. My brother attended a local program that was partially state-funded, so what exactly were those transfers covering? And then I saw something stranger. A lump sum, years ago, marked as reimbursement. Reimbursement for what? The date lined up with something I barely remembered, a period when my brother spent several months in a specialized private program out of town. I remember visiting once. I remember thinking it was expensive. I also remember overhearing an argument between my parents and grandparents around that time. Something about responsibility. Something about who should be paying. For the first time, a different possibility emerged. What if the inheritance wasn't balancing childhood attention? What if it was settling a debt? And if it was, whose debt was it, really? I didn't sleep much that week. There's something about spreadsheets at 2 a.m. that makes everything feel accusatory. Rows of numbers. Dates. Silent proof that something happened, even if you don't yet understand what. The reimbursement transfer kept bothering me. It wasn't a small amount. It was almost identical to the current estimated value of the inheritance after growth. Not exact, but close enough to feel deliberate. I called the private program my brother attended years ago. I didn't expect them to share anything, but sometimes tone matters more than authority. I framed it as a state clarification. After some back and forth, the administrator confirmed something simple. My grandparents were the original financial guarantors for my brother's enrollment. Not my parents, my grandparents, but according to the file, there had been a dispute over responsibility midway through his stay. Payments paused briefly. Then resumed. I asked who ultimately settled the balance. There was a pause. Records indicate the guarantor withdrew responsibility. The outstanding balance was cleared by the parents. Cleared, with what money? I went back to the financial statements. The reimbursement transfer from my grandparents to my parents happened 2 months after that program ended. 2 months, it didn't take a genius to see the pattern. My grandparents initially agreed to pay. Something changed. My parents covered the cost. Then my grandparents reimbursed them, but if that's all it was, why did the reimbursement matter now? Unless my grandparents later believed that money should never have been theirs to reimburse, unless they felt manipulated into paying something they shouldn't have, and if that's true, then the inheritance wasn't balancing attention, it was undoing a financial decision, one my parents might not have been honest about. Suddenly, their urgency made more sense. If I signed everything over, the money would flow right back to where they believed it belonged, quietly. Cleanly, no questions asked, but I still didn't know the one thing that mattered most. Why would my grandparents think they were misled, and what, exactly, had my parents told them. I didn't plan a dramatic reveal. I didn't rehearse speeches, I just showed up at my parents' house with copies of the documents in a manila envelope. My brother was there, sitting in his usual spot, flipping through channels. The TV volume was low. He looked up, nodded at me, then went back to staring at the screen. I asked my parents if we could talk privately. We went to the kitchen. I placed the envelope on the table between us and slid out the reimbursement record. Why did Grandpa reimburse you for the program? My father's jaw tightened immediately. My mother didn't touch the paper, they agreed to cover it, she said, and then they changed their minds. I asked, silence. I pulled out the administrator's confirmation. You were listed as the final payer. Then 2 months later, they sent you almost the exact amount back. My father's voice lowered. That was settled years ago. Settled how? He looked at my mother before answering. That glance told me more than the words would. There was a misunderstanding, he said. About what? My pulse was steady, but I could feel something cracking under the surface. Did you tell them the program was my idea? I asked. Neither of them responded immediately. I hadn't even known that possibility existed until I said it out loud, but suddenly it felt plausible. I had visited once and told my grandparents it seemed helpful. I remember saying, it's probably good for him. Did that become consent? Did that become responsibility? My mother finally spoke. We told them you supported it. That's not what I asked. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, there was something close to guilt there. We told them, she said carefully, that you wanted him to go. The room felt smaller. That's not the same thing. My father's voice hardened. You did want him to get better. Yes. That doesn't mean I volunteered to finance it. He didn't deny it, and that was the moment I realized something heavier than money was sitting on that table. They hadn't just shifted responsibility, they had shifted narrative, but I still didn't understand why that would matter enough for my grandparents to structure the inheritance around it, unless the lie went deeper than a single program. The next part didn't come from my parents, it came from my brother. I wasn't expecting that. After the kitchen conversation stalled into tight silence, I walked back into the living room. He muted the TV without me asking. You found out, he said. It wasn't a question. I sat down across from him. Found out what? He rubbed his hands together the way he does when he's organizing his thoughts. Slow. Repetitive. They argued about it, he said. Grandma and Dad. I heard them once. About the program? He nodded. About who was supposed to pay. Grandma said it wasn't fair to make you responsible. Responsible, the word again. I wasn't responsible, I said quietly. He hesitated. Dad told them you asked for it. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Asked for what? For them to help. For him. He gestured vaguely toward himself. He said you felt guilty. Guilty? My mind raced back. Guilty for what? Then it hit me. When I was 14, I had a breakdown. I told my parents I felt like everything in our house revolved around managing crises. I said sometimes I wish things were quieter. Easier. A week later, they toured that private program. Did they interpret that as me wanting him sent away, or did they present it that way to my grandparents? I stared at my brother. Do you think I wanted you gone? He looked down. That's what they told me. There it was, not just a financial lie, a relational one. My parents didn't just tell my grandparents I supported the program, they told my brother I pushed for it, and if my grandparents believed I carried guilt for displacing him, reimbursing that money would make sense. And later, giving me the inheritance would make even more, because from their perspective, I had been burdened twice, first emotionally, then financially. But here's the part that twisted everything: if my grandparents structured the inheritance to correct a lie, then the entire estate was built on a version of me that wasn't real, and my parents knew it. Once I realized the inheritance was built on a lie, the pieces fell into place, and they were uglier than I imagined. My parents weren't asking me to give it to my brother out of generosity. They were asking me to erase the evidence. To tidy up a story that could make them look manipulative. They had convinced my grandparents I was the one responsible for the program, the one who carried guilt for sending my brother away, and the inheritance was supposed to cement that narrative. If I refused, That narrative could unravel. My grandparents might start asking questions. My brother might realize something deeper had been concealed from him all his life. The family image, so carefully curated, could collapse. I sat in my apartment late that night, staring at the copies of all the documents. I could see exactly why they'd engineered it this way. They had made my sacrifice appear noble, inevitable, even self-imposed. They had turned me into the hero of a story I didn't live. And handing over the inheritance would finalize the lie, turning me into the silent enforcer of their version of truth. Part of me wanted to do it. It would have been easier. It would have kept my brother comfortable. It would have kept my parents unchallenged. The word responsible echoed in my head again, the word they had assigned to me for years. But I couldn't. I couldn't give up money, yes, but more importantly, I couldn't give up the truth. The real confrontation wasn't with my brother. It wasn't even with my parents. It was with the story they had written about me. And refusing to sign didn't feel like selfishness. It felt like reclaiming a life they'd rewritten. But doing so meant I would become the villain in their narrative. The one who refused family obligation. The one who didn't put need before fairness. I realized, then, that this wasn't just about money or guilt. It was about control, history, and perception. And I had a choice: preserve the lie, or preserve myself. Refusing to sign was quiet. No shouting. No doors slamming. Just a stack of papers on my kitchen counter, untouched, staring back at me. The first few days were tense, but subtle. My parents didn't call as often. When they did, their voices were clipped, polite, but I could feel the weight of judgment through the line. My brother didn't bring it up. Not once. I think he sensed that something had shifted, but he didn't know how to name it. I tried to resume normal routines, but everything felt heavy. Grocery trips, phone calls, even casual messages from friends, all filtered through a lens I couldn't remove. There was a gnawing awareness that family dynamics had changed permanently. When I visited my parents a week later, the house felt smaller. The living room, the kitchen, even the hallways seemed charged. Every glance from my mother, every sigh from my father, carried unspoken meaning. They were evaluating me. Judging me. And I knew it. I thought about my brother constantly. He was innocent in all of this, yet part of me wondered if I was punishing him by refusing the inheritance. He might have had a better, more secure life if I had just signed. And guilt settled into my chest like a stone I couldn't lift, but then, in quiet moments, I reminded myself that I wasn't the villain. I was simply the only one aware of the truth. The lie had been hidden for decades. And handing over the inheritance would have made me complicit. I began keeping detailed records. Notes. Emails. Evidence of everything I had discovered. Part of me wanted to protect myself. Part of me wanted the story preserved, even if it meant tension with my family for years to come. Some nights, I sit alone and wonder if I'll ever be able to explain it to my brother without shattering the fragile version of our relationship he's always known, and that's the cruelest part. Protecting the truth might hurt the people I care about the most. Weeks have passed, and the house feels emptier when I visit. The inheritance still sits untouched in my name, a silent weight in my life. My parents' eyes linger on me differently now, calculated, cautious, maybe even resentful, but I can't tell if it's disappointment or fear of being exposed. My brother glances at me sometimes, curious, maybe suspicious, but he never asks. I thought refusing would bring clarity, but instead it has only sharpened the edges of the question I can't answer. How far does family obligation go when fairness collides with truth? Every time I picture signing those papers, I imagine the smile on my brother's face, relieved, unbothered. And every time I imagine keeping the inheritance, I feel my grandparents' judgment echoing across the years, as if they somehow knew the lie that built it. I can feel myself split into two versions: the dutiful son who follows the plan, who sacrifices for what is needed, and the one who refuses to be rewritten, even if that makes him selfish in everyone else's eyes. Some nights, I imagine telling my brother everything: the financial maneuvering, the misrepresented intentions, the hidden truths my parents manipulated. But then I see his face, and I wonder if revealing the truth would free him, or just shatter a life he's always trusted. I've realized that no choice here feels purely right. Every action carries consequences. Every refusal carries guilt. Every compliance carries betrayal, and so I leave it like this, hovering in uncertainty. Because in families, sometimes the question isn't about what's legally yours. It's about what you can live with, and what you're willing to lose to preserve, or destroy, the story everyone else believes. I've kept the inheritance. My brother smiles when he sees me. My parents nod politely. The lie remains partially intact, but inside, I keep asking myself every day, am I protecting the truth, or just proving that fairness isn't the same as love? The answer doesn't come easy. And maybe it never will.